What's up, YouTube? This is Too Raw for TV. All right, man. Um, it's no secret that a lot of people have issues with JJ Redick, okay, the puppet coach of the Los Angeles Fakers, who is only there because of his relationship with LeBron James, the de facto dictator of the NBA. But before he got that token position, um, JJ Redick was pissed off a lot of people because of his haughtiness, because of his know-it-all demeanor. It's funny. Remember when Stephen A. Snitch was talking about Kyrie Irving? He was saying how Kyrie thinks he's above everybody else. Everybody's down here, and he's way up in the stratosphere in his mind. It's funny he never described JJ Redick like that, because JJ is the epitome of that. He's always the smartest man in the room. He knows it all, etc., etc. Not to mention the fact that there's allegations about him being, let's just say he would have been a proud voter of George Wallace back in the day. But anyway, enough is enough when it comes to this guy. A lot of people are now speaking out. We know Jerry West, before he passed away, had his thing. He said what he said about JJ Redick. We know what Bob Cousy said. Bob Cousy destroyed him. And now, newly enshrined NBA Hall of Famer Tim Hardaway went in on JJ Redick. So, Tim Hardaway said about him and about his critique of his era, the 80s and 90s, quote, "Back then, basketball was a battle," right? He said, in the Park District, talking about JJ Redick, he wouldn't even play back then. Because what he's referring to is JJ Redick's consistent critique of the skill set and the level of competition in the 80s and 90s. Tim Hardaway went on to go say about Redick's ability to evaluate an era he never experienced. Quote, "How can you talk about that era when you never played in it?" Hardaway argued, pointing out the lack of understanding Redick might have of the physicality and culture of basketball during those decades. Hardaway also took aim at Redick's claim that players of the 80s and 90s weren't athletic, highlighting stars like Dominique Wilkins and Michael Jordan as counter examples. There were a lot of guys who were athletic and could play. He emphasized that while the game has evolved, dismissing the skills of earlier players ignores the unique challenges they faced and the context in which they excelled. Look, of course, JJ Redick would like the game of today because it mimics his skill set. Standing around the perimeter, shooting threes, and not being able to play defense and not really being a good defender. See, these things were, look, Tim Legler, Steve Kerr, who were basically JJ Redick's counterparts in the old league, right? First of all those guys were better knockdown shooters than he were. Although, he might have been a little bit bigger, a little bit stronger. I mean, JJ Redick was a hell of a college player. I give him that. But that doesn't always transition to being a great pro. But the thing about it, Steve Kerr, they weren't great defenders, but they gave effort. JJ Redick was a liability and oftentimes was taken off the floor because of his lack of defensive ability. Aside from Grant Hill and maybe a couple other guys, the Duke curses that a lot of those great Dukies just didn't make great NBA players. Of course, there were exceptions. Like I said before, Grant Hill, Elton Brand, and maybe a couple others. But look, The 1980s and 90s had a lot of great athletes. Like he said, Michael Jordan, right? Like he said, Dominique Wilkins. You also, of course, had Sean Kemp. Scottie Pippen was a great athlete. Grant Hill was a great athlete. Penny Hardaway was a very good athlete. Kobe Bryant was a great athlete, right? I really don't know what the fuck some of these dudes are talking about. If you're talking about guys who could jump out the gym and uh, guys who were physical specimens, I mean, we can go through the NBA for this. Harold Miner was a great athlete, right? Not necessarily a great player, but he was a great athlete, right? Um, but see, that's the thing. In my opinion, the 80s and 90s had the best mix of all of it. You had your shooters, you had your 3-point specialists, the guys I named, Steve Kerr, you had Tim Legler, you had Craig Hodges, you had Trent Tucker, you had a little bit later on, you had guys like Jason Capono, who didn't play that long, but had a nice little start. Uh, you had those types of players. You had your 3-and-D guys who can knock down the three at a really good rate, but played great defense. One of the guys that comes to mind is Rashawn Leonard. Roger Bell became a 3-and-D guy eventually. Even though he was not a good free throw shooter, Bruce Bowen became a 3-and-D guy. At least he could knock him down if he was open, especially in the corners. You had your great enforcers, guys who were able to normally great enforcers were great defenders, post defenders. They're usually rugged rebounders. Some of them could score. You know what I'm saying? You always would get a good 9 to 10 points a game, 8, 9, 10, 11 rebounds a night. And another thing they did was protect the star. The enforcers, because the league was more physical, you needed the enforcer to protect the stars. That's what it was for. Guys like Charles Oakley, guys like Xavier McDaniel, guys like Charles Barkley to a great extent. Although he was more of a star, he couldn't just waste fouls like that. But, you had those guys. You had earlier on Maurice Lucas, Kermit Washington. You had these different facets of the game. Of course, you had your superstar slashers, a young Julius Erving, a young Scottie Pippen, a young Michael Jordan, a young Clyde Drexler. You had those types of guys. It was very exciting to watch, And then I also make this point because I don't want to keep going on and on and on endlessly. But you had your great pass first guards, Magic Johnson, right? Kevin Porter. Who else? His Magic's teammate was a great passer in his own right. Norm Nixon. Mark Price was a great point guard. And there was a lot of great guards. Fat Lever. I don't know what these guys are talking about, man. If you go through, the thing is, they're so ignorant. A lot of these dudes, they're so ignorant that they don't know these guys. Instead of just saying, I don't know who these people are, you just dismiss them and say, oh, they're nobody. As I said before, look, Larry Bird played against more talented small forwards than LeBron James could even think of, could dream of. I mean, in LeBron's prime, what other really great small forwards were there in the league? In his prime. Like the years we kept going to the finals for 8 years in a row, 2010, 11, to 2018. What other really great small forwards were there? Kawhi Leonard developed into one. Paul George had a stretch. KD. That's about it, right? As far as great small forwards. Paul Pierce had gotten old. Larry Bird had to go up against Dominique Wilkins, who was an absolute beast, right? He had to go up against Alex English, Adrian Dantley. Every guy just named the scoring title champions. He had to go up against Bernard King, another scoring title champion. Bernard King was probably the most scariest scorer the game had ever seen in that era. If he had put it all together, he'd have been one of the great top 20 players of all time. The guy had the great mid-range. I mean, the guy was probably the best mid-range player in the game in his prime. He had the quickest release in the NBA. He was unstoppable in the post, and he was unstoppable in transition before the knee injury. Wasn't the most athletic guy, but he was just unstoppable, tremendous shot maker. If he got within really 9 to 10 feet from the basket, he was basically unstoppable. He had to go up against James Worthy. He had to go up against who else? What other players are there out there I'm not thinking of as far as small forwards? He had to go up against, a little later on in his career, Chris Mullin. You know what I'm saying? He had to go up against Kelly Tripucka. He had to go up against a multitude of great small forwards. Later on, Scottie Pippen himself, right? So many great players. Mark Aguirre. He had to go up against all these different guys, man, at that position. Julius Erving. I forgot to even mention him. George Gervin sometimes plays small forward. Then it was just such a talent-laden NBA in the 80s and 90s. Stockton and Malone and Tim Hardaway and Mitch Richmond, and I already said Chris Mullin, I think, right? Then of course you had Gary Payton and Sean Kemp, and it was just so many different players, great players, even some guys who are not as heralded, but were great in their own right and would have been perennial all-stars in a lesser league. Like Terry Porter comes to mind. Terry Porter was a beast. Kenny Anderson was a great point guard. Back then, everybody just didn't play the same. And I'm going to tell you another thing guys could do back then. They were point guards. They had a post game. Sam Cassell had a post game. Gary Payton had a post game. These guys will back you down. These guys, they don't have fucking post game. Ben Simmons is such a nutcase, he can't even score in an open transition situation anymore. He's afraid to fucking score. These guys are mental midgets compared to what was going on in the NBA back then, man. Come on, man. Like you said, how can JJ Redick critique an era that he didn't even participate in? I mean, they get on us for saying, oh, you guys, you don't know how these guys are doing today's NBA. That's a fair point. Possibly. Although I tend to think that with less resistance and when making adjustments as far as getting, becoming more acclimated as a three-point shooter, I can't help but think that these guys would flourish in today's NBA. By the way, Tim Hardaway said he thinks he would average 40 points per game in today's NBA. I think that's a bit much, but I could definitely see a case of him averaging 30 because there's no resistance. Before the knee injury, before the knee injury that he suffered, was it 93, 94, 93? Before that knee injury, that version of Tim Hardaway, yeah, I think he could average 30 points a game. Absolutely. Even the Miami Heat version, I think, would average 26, 27. But yeah, man, shout out to Tim Hardaway Sr. for calling out this foolishness. And I'm glad a lot more of these people, a lot of you guys are coming out and countering this disgusting, misinformation and disrespect that's coming out from these dudes, man. And it's not being challenged by the media. They're already trying to destroy legends who aren't here no more, like Bill Russell and Wilt Chamberlain. Completely trying to destroy their legacies. It's disgusting.